Okay, I guess we'll get started. I think someone from Israel 365 was supposed to be on this, but I don't see him. But it is time to get started, so we will get started.
Bible too.
Okay, so this week's Torah portion is Lech Lecha, and it begins with Genesis 12. And it's wonderful. Everything we've been talking about until now is really coming to a head here because we're going into a whole different dimension, and this dimension will actually carry us through the rest of the Bible. Okay, just to remind you what did we do in the past? We talked about creation. We talked about God's promise to man, the obligation to be fruitful and multiply, which is also an obligation, but also a promise that there will be humanity. We talked about the fact that everything went wrong. We had the flood, and then God tried again with Noah. And then we had an individual who was responsible for starting the world again. But the system wasn't changed. It was still one person who was going to be fruitful and multiply. But there was no specific promise, no specific destiny, no specific anything for a given person or individual. This was another try at humanity, and again it failed. And at the end of last week's portion, we see the Tower of Babel, where all these different people are uniting together to do a very bad thing, to try to compete or fight with God at some level. And therefore, we have this dispersion, and for the first time, we have the concept of separate nations. And it is out of that context of separate nations that we now begin with Abraham, because we have Abraham now being given a very separate destiny for a very separate nation. Okay, so let's look at now. I don't have anybody. Usually, the fellow from Israel 365 is on and he shares screen. I don't do share screen. So if you have a Bible on you, great, open it. And if not, I will just be reading you and explaining what there is to read. Okay, so we're in Genesis chapter 12. Okay, the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And this, of course, is God speaking to Abram when he is in Haran, which is today northern Syria, on the border of Syria and Turkey. He has already left Ur of the Chaldees and gone with his father up and settled in the north there in Haran. And here God speaks to him and saying, okay, you have to separate from your family. You are going to be given now a new mission, and he sends him on his way. Before he leaves, as part of this commandment, God already makes certain promises. He says, I will make of you a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. In other words, this initial blessing that's being given to Abraham already positions him to be a sort of father, a sort of leader, a messenger, God's messenger to the world. Through Abraham, many peoples will be blessed. Okay, Abraham goes. His first stop, and let's remember, when God gives him the commandment, he says, go to the land that I will show you. He doesn't tell him which land that is. He clearly directs him in a certain direction. And it's later on in verse 6 that he arrives in the land of Israel, which is then called the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanites are then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram, saying, I will give this land to your children. And he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Here we have the second promise. And this time it's a promise that God makes to Abraham in the land of Israel, and it's far more specific than the original promise. I will give this land to your children. Here for the first time we have a promise to Abraham that his children will be a nation, and that nation will get a specific land, this land, the land of Israel, the land I'm actually sitting in right now, and that I wish you could join me in right now, but most of you are all over the place and the skies are closed, but what can we do about that? Nothing right now. All right, anyway, so really this is a defining moment. not only for the Jewish people, but for the entire Bible. Because from this moment on, the book becomes a book about the Jewish people, God's message to the Jewish people, and what the role of the Jewish people is, not only for themselves, but vis-a-vis the entire world. Now, of course, there's also all of that destiny of the Jewish people. We don't exactly know what that destiny is yet, but we do know that destiny is tied up with a land. That God says, I will give this land to your children. So we have a meeting here at this one place, at the Oak of Moreh, at Elon Moreh. We have a meeting of the God of Israel, the land of Israel, and the people of Israel for the first time. Okay, now, I would like to refer to a very important classic Jewish commentator. His name is Rashi. And when people begin to learn Bible with Jewish teachers for the first time, he is usually the first commentator that we use. And in fact, when children begin learning the Bible, it is the first commentator that they will encounter. It's printed in every Bible, and wonderful, wonderful commentator. Makes very important insights, sometimes very simple, but so clear and so important. His comment, not here, I'm not going to discuss what he comments here, but I want to go back to the very first comment that he makes from the beginning of the Bible, the comment that he makes at the beginning of Genesis. On the very first verse, the very first chapter of Genesis, he says as follows. He says, first of all, he asks a question. He says, why is it that the Bible begins here with Genesis rather than having it begin with Exodus 12? Exodus 12 is the first commandment given to the nation of Israel. And what this question indicates is a certain assumption. If indeed this is a Bible that's given to the Jewish people, isn't it really, first and foremost, a book of laws? If it is a book of laws, then you need to start with the first law. And the first law to the nation of Israel is in Exodus 12, where it begins the laws of Passover. Actually, the first law that's mentioned there talks about declaring the month, the new month, the lunar month. Okay. And he answers, okay, he says, because, and he quotes here a passage, a very short verse from Psalms 111, okay? He told the power of his deeds to his nation in order to give them the territory of nations. And what does he explain? He says, the whole point of the first 11 chapters, actually he's talking about the whole first book of Genesis and half of Exodus, but let's start now with the first 11 chapters because it's relevant to our question as well. Why didn't we start the story? If we say already that we want to start the story because we don't want to just have a book of laws, we want to know about the people who founded the nation, and through them we can understand the behaviors. So why do we need the first 11 chapters? The first 11 chapters are universal chapters. Beginning with chapter 12, we have the story of the Jewish people beginning. And what is the answer? He says, if the nations of the world will come to you, Jewish people, and accuse you of stealing this land, you will be able to say to them, it is God who created the entire universe. God can decide who he gives which piece of land to. Now, I think what is represented here, it's not just a question of is this a book of laws or not. I want to put that aside. But the underlying assumption of this comment is the fact that the critical element here in this Bible is the giving of the land of Israel to the Jewish people. That's the critical element. Yeah. And that's what Rashi hones in on as that one thing that the nations are going to challenge us on. And therefore, we need the first 11 chapters because that tells us the story of God, the creator of the universe. And it talks about, and I will extend what Rashi says in line with what we've been teaching. It talks about the various attempts to bring God's word to humanity as a whole through the entire universe. And that failed twice. And so therefore, what God is doing now is going to select a man who is going to, through him, we will select a people, and there will be a selection of a land. And it is not just about giving the land to a given people. It is about giving the land to the people so that they can have a message for the nations. Because this is the Jewish people are not just standing saying, this is my land, don't take it from me. It is part of the message that the people of Israel have to the nations about the land. This whole story enables the nations of the world to understand it is God who has created the world. It is God who runs the world. And therefore, it is God who has selected Abraham and ultimately the Jewish people and the land of Israel to be his messenger or his shofar to the nations. So this is really what we're beginning to discuss when we begin with Genesis chapter 12. Okay, now let's see what actually happens after Abraham is in the land and he starts to travel. Okay, and we're going to see now a number of different promises. Oh, hello, Israel 365. Okay, we need now Genesis 13. Move on. I don't know if they're there. Okay, here we go. Genesis 13, verse 14. Okay, you all see the screen. Good. That's excellent. Okay, when is this happening? What I'm doing now is this was the initial promises we encountered before Abraham left on his journey and as soon as he arrived. Now we're going to see there's going to be additional promises and in fact, 2 covenants that God will enter into with Abraham here in our Torah portion. They will be moving our story along. Okay, so in chapter 13, where are we? The verse begins, the Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him. Okay, this is a significant time, and one of the things we're going to see throughout the book of Genesis is not only a process of selection and a promise, but as that promise is passed from generation to generation, God is going to make it clear that that promise passes to this particular descendant or to this relative and not to the other one. And our first separation happens right here, okay? Because initially, Abraham took Lot. Lot is his nephew, and it's not his son, but as far as he's concerned, he treats him as a son. And so when he first gets that promise from God, I will give this land to your children, he assumes that Lot and his family will be part of that promise, okay? And then there's a fight among the shepherds, and it becomes clear that they have to separate. And it's very interesting, by the way, that when what does Abraham say? And I'm not showing it here, but just believe me, I'm just summarizing. Abraham says to Lot, okay, I'm going to give you first choice. If you go to the right, I will go to the left. And if you go to the left, I will go to the right. Now, one of the things you have to know that from a biblical context, when someone talks about right or left, they are facing east. Okay? Because in the Bible, the origin, in other words, the way today we have a compass and we say, find the North Star first, you face north, and then you do east and west. Well, in biblical times, you faced east. And that's actually very interesting because east is where you had the Fertile Crescent. East is where you had the beginning of civilization. You faced east and then you have right and left, which means that Abraham was actually offering Lot to divide the land between north and south. Okay? But Lot doesn't say, I'll take north or I'll take south. He actually looks to the east and says, I'm going to take the area of Sodom, which means basically he's already by his own choice inched his way out of the land of Israel. He's at the eastern edge of Israel, and of course we know later on that Sodom will be destroyed, and he will be east of the Jordan in what becomes Moab and Ammon. Okay? So at this point, we have a separation from Lot that is not just a separation of the shepherds because of the shepherds, it's a separation that becomes fundamental because Lot has already have been eased out or on his way to being eased out of the land of Israel. Okay? He's there, and where is he actually, after that happens, where is he located, Abraham himself? He's sitting between Beit El and the Eye, or some in English called the AI. Okay? Actually, we have an amazing virtual tour that we have done, and then it's online, and I will send that all to you, where we do a teaching right at that place where they do that separation. Okay? Anyway, there he is in the middle of the land on the mountain, somewhat near, let's say, Ophrah of today. Okay, for those of you who know the map of Israel. And what happens afterwards? And the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west, for I will give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. Okay? Wait, where did my scripture go?
Lost.
Got lost. Okay. Okay. Okay, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offsprings will be counted. Okay? So we have here, and then he says, go, get up, walk through the land, its length and breadth, for I give it to you. I will give it to you. Okay? And then we learned that he moves. Abram moved his tent and came to dwell at the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. He built an altar there to the Lord. Okay? So at this point, Lot has gone east, and on his way out, Abraham goes to Hebron. Hebron, of course, is a very, very, very important place. But we see here, God is again repeating this promise. He's now saying he's going to give the land forever. It'll be theirs forever. And he's saying that the children, it's not just that I give this land to your children, but the children will be so multiple, so many, that it'll be impossible to count them. Okay, now let's go on to the next verses. Chapter 14, verse 19. Okay. Here we have, just after there's a battle, a big war, actually a world war between 4 kings and 5 kings here in the Middle East, and Lot is captured, and Abraham joins this war, and afterwards the people he has helped, the kingdoms that he has helped, which includes the king of Sodom, come to thank him, and one of the people that comes to thank him is someone named Melchizedek, or Melchizedek in English, and he comes to him, and what does he say here? He says, he gives him a blessing. He says, bless the Abraham of the Almighty, God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and bless to God Almighty, who has delivered your foes into your hand. And, okay, so basically what we have here is, in a way, a realization of the first promise that God made to Abraham. I can't change the screen. I don't know how to do this. No, I don't know how to change the screen. Thank you. Okay, forget it. No more scriptures. I will just talk. Okay. What has happened is that we see the first promise that God made to Abraham was that all those who bless you will be blessed. And here we have the first example of someone blessing Abraham. This is a man who himself is a priest to the one God, okay? And which is amazing because at that time, we only know of pagan worshipers. And here we meet this one man, Melchizedek, who seems to be a priest to the one God, creator of the universe. And he comes and he blesses Abraham. And that's quite an unusual situation, and one that I see as being a realization of that initial promise to Abraham. Okay, now we're going to move on to some of these covenants that we're going to discover. And we'll start in chapter 15, verse 4. Here we have already Abraham, by the way, being very concerned. God is saying he's going to give you a great deal of reward, and Abraham is concerned. He says, but I don't have any children. And then God takes him out and shows him, and he says, but you will have so many children. It's very similar to what he promised him earlier, except instead of talking about the dust, he's talking about the stars. Look towards heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he added, so shall your offspring be. And then, of course, Abraham believes God. Okay? And then verse 7 begins again, and God spoke and said. So that whenever you have scripture beginning with the new and God spoke, that is going to be a new conversation. Okay? And so here we have a new conversation. There was the promise and taking him out and seeing the stars and all that. And now we have a new promise. And that promise leads us into a whole ceremony that is called the Covenant of the Pieces, Brit Ben Avtarim. And this is where God continues and makes promises again, but we'll see even in the language of the promise that we're going to see a progression. It's going to be something else. It's not the same as before. Okay? Let's take a look. Let's look at verse 13. Okay? This is beginning of the promise. We have the whole ceremony. We have the cutting of the pieces, and Abraham has a dream and the whole thing. But now this is actually God's words of promise. Verse 13. And he said to Abraham, you should know that your children will be enslaved in maybe I read from it. Know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a ripe old age. And they shall return here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay, that is the important. This is the most, shall we say, this is the first covenant that God makes with Abraham. It is not just a promise; it is a covenant. And the ceremony of the covenant, by the way, I once heard a lecture that was fascinating that talked about this idea of splitting animals and walking between animals, what was indeed an ancient way of entering to covenants. So in a sense, God and Abraham are walking between these split animals. What they're actually doing is saying it's not just a promise, it's a covenant. A covenant is more solid. It's if you think about it from a legal point of view, okay, and I have a legal background, so I think these ways very, very naturally, okay, there's a difference between someone makes a promise and someone signs a contract, okay? A promise, even a person who's reliable and trustworthy, his promise is as good as a promise. There's always going to be a weak link in that promise, whereas a contract has legal force and can be enforced in a court of law, and you can sue on a contract. You can't sue on a promise, okay? So when God takes the promise and turns it into a covenant, he's making it much more set in stone, if you will. And one of the ways that we can see the difference in the validity of this, if we look at verse 18, which is a summary, so to speak, of what just happened. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I assign this land. Oh, now I'm always having trouble with these translations, okay? Because in the Hebrew, it says natati, okay? Natati is past tense. What actually is saying is that on that day, God entered into a covenant with Abraham, saying, I have given this land to your children, from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates. Okay? I have given. Until now, God said, I will give. Here, for the first time, he says, I have given. And I think that reflects the more binding nature of a covenant. When you sign a covenant, when you enter into a covenant, it's as if the transfer has already been done. Now, it's not for Abraham. God says very specifically here, it will be for his children, and even mentions that it'll be 4 generations. They're going to have to be enslaved, and we know they'll be enslaved in Egypt, and only then will they come out. It's roughly 400 years from this point in time, okay? But by saying I gave as opposed to I will give, what God is doing is saying once the covenant has been signed, it's as if it is already done. The legal right has already been announced, okay? We have a very similar kind of wording with the next covenant, which is circumcision. Now, in the circumcision, let's take a look at chapter 17 from the beginning. Chapter 17, we have a situation where now there's going to be another covenant. The covenant itself, the sign of the covenant is the circumcision. And here in verse 7, God says as follows, I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, to be God to you and to your offspring to come. We have two elements here. First of all, it's everlasting, okay? And also, it's not just about giving the land of Israel, but that I will be their God. We have this unbelievable coming together. Not just I promise the land to your children, or I've already given the land, as we saw it before, and we see it here again. Okay, here again we have vinatati, I have given. Again, past tense, because it's a covenant and it's already come to be. And it's a legal right, even though the children are going to be the ones who are actually going to receive it, and that happens to happen in the future. But we have here, first of all, that the land itself will be an everlasting possession, and we have a part of that, though, is not just the land, but that God will be their God. So we have here until now, we have God has promised to Abraham, all those who bless you will be blessed. God has selected Abraham. So you know there's a special connection between God and Abraham. And then God promises the land to Abraham's children. But now what we get in this circumcision covenant is that God now will become the God of the nation of Israel. There becomes a special relationship now, not just between the people of Israel and the land of Israel, but between the people of Israel and the God of Israel. And this is all before there isn't even a nation of Israel. At this point, all we have is Abraham, and promises for the future. I would like to focus, though, on the first verse in chapter 17, just before we get to this circumcision. And I'll read it as follows. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. Now, if you remember, we talked about this kind of wording, walk. Actually, it says here, walk in my ways. I don't like that translation. I don't know, what does it say here? Walk in my ways. It's exactly the same words that we saw before with Noah and with Hanoch. Walk before me. It was either someone who walked before God or that walked with God. Here it's the very same words. Hanoch walked with God. He had no influence. He was taken away from this world early. Noah walked with God, didn't succeed in having influence. His descendants end up falling into the same cycle of corruption and problems that Adam's children went into. We need another restart. But here we have the selection of Abraham. And after Abraham is being given promises about his children, God says, walk before me and be blameless. Tamim, it's the same purity, blameless, pure, the same words that we see with Noah, okay? Also, Noah walked with God and was pure. I can read you the exact scripture on that. This is the line of Noah. He was a righteous and tamim. He was a tamim man. He was a pure man, and he walked with God. Walked with Noah, or Noah walked with God. So almost in Hebrew, you can really see it. Okay, tamim italech, the same words with both of them. Okay, but what a difference. Because in this case, everything about Abraham and everything about the selection of Abraham takes us to his children. It will be a continuity. God will become the God of the children. And this indeed will be the promise that will last. This will be the promise that will continue us into the future, into eternity, as God has promised, an everlasting possession, and they will be for your God. And I will just end one more scripture, which we'll probably see again, in chapter 17, verse 18. Here, God is promising, this is really an introduction to next week, because next week we're already going to talk about, the birth of Isaac. Here, already at the end of chapter 17, God promises Abraham that he will have a son, Yitzchak. And he says, but I already have a son, Ishmael. And he says, no. He says, look at verse, here we go. Abraham says in verse 18, and Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live by your favor. God said, nevertheless, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. As for Ishmael, I have heeded you. I hereby bless him. And it continues with the blessings for Ishmael. God makes it very clear. And this begins or continues this process of selection that we talked about. Abram is the selected. This selection will go to his children, which is central to this idea of promise and covenant here. But God continues to select. Lot was rejected. Now Ishmael will be rejected. And the progeny of Abraham that will continue the promise and the covenant will be only Isaac. Have a great week. It was good seeing you all. Those of you, anybody that you know missed it, we'll be sending you a link. Have a great weekend.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.